Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you so much for coming, and sorry because we have to start late, but thank you for your patience. So as Matthew said, I am Oba, and today I think it's a very important event, especially if you are more concerned about the climate change and how it's affecting in the Horn of Africa. And of course, it's not about the environment, but also it goes beyond that. And because we have these three intellectuals who know more about the Horn and who actually know, how it feels to live in that kind of situation. I think we will hear more about their stories and how they view about the region and, how the climate change is affecting the Horn of Africa. But also we have Laura, who has the academia dynamic and the political dimension of this. So I think it would be very important to have different dimensions and different perspectives about this topic. So I will call each panelists will have 15 minutes to 10 minutes to speak about what they're doing in the Horn and how they see this issue, and also at the end you will have time to ask them questions. So please, as they speak, take notes, and maybe if you have any questions, just take a note and then you can ask them later. So our first speaker will be Saadia, and she will introduce herself, and as I said before, if you have any questions, ask later. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Saadia Musa Ahmed. I am the country director of an organization called PENHA, Pastoral and Environmental Network in the Horn of Africa. We work in the Horn of Africa region, IGAD region. Our organization focuses on pastoralism and agro-pastoralism, and we are really working on that level for a long time. Now, just to kick off this discussion tonight, we're talking about climate change. And climate change, when you look at it, we're talking about how does it affect livelihoods, lifestyles, environment, and all other things that is coming in, like ecology, all these things. But it's not because of the climate change is also destroying everything else. It's also the livelihood, the systems that we're going. If I look at pastoralism, for example, it used to be a system that has been there relied on thousands of years of development. And it has got its own culture, governance, lifestyles, economic prospects, and its patterns. But that has been changed for a while now. And it's not only the pastoralism, it's the same thing though with all the primary production systems. Because we are all becoming too much urbanized, and too much interference from people who are not really pastoralists, including government, other land users, politics, policies, all these things are. So what do we have? If you look at the pastoralism today, and if you look pastoralism in, say, 70, 80 years ago, there's quite a distinct difference in there. Because at that time, as an economy, it was a stable economy. Okay, it always have got a drought, it always have got problems, but that, for example, drought is used to be something like a cycle of 20 years. So people has got their own livelihood, is stabilized most of the time. They might have conflicts here and there in terms of having a shortage of water and things like that. But in reality, it was an economy that was really functioning properly. Since then, we have got governments who are not really that much focused on the production systems of the nation. And we have got a lot of other issues coming in. We are preferring agriculture, or let's say crop production, or agriculture general, because agriculture includes pastoralism, but usually we don't use it that way. So things are really changing. We have got too many land users, and the issue of land tenure become an issue. So we used to have in Somaliland 52 plains and forests that was used to be conserved. We call it range reserves. So you have got seasonal range reserves. We used to have drought reserves. We used to have permanent reserves. And then forests that's not been touched. It's not allowed anybody to settle down. Dala Mountain, Wagar Mountain, Gaan Libah, Libahiyale, and so many so forth. So these are areas that we're not supposed to be, because we have got these forests where especially more on misty forests than the normal ones. We also have got other forests everywhere. So what happened now? If you look at the things that now, challenges that people are facing, number one, urbanization or settlements is becoming an issue. So people want to be in the towns rather than being there. Why? Number one, Somaliland used to be, Somalia in general, was an livestock exporting country. We used to export that livestock since the 40s or even earlier. And that has got too many returns for the livestock owners. But since then, we have got a lot of other problems, including bans, livestock ban. We have got a lot of other problems like competitions, too much competition like Australian sheep or anything. We have got a lot of politics in it. Because at the time it was just an economy, now it also have a lot of politics. So you can be easily, that has been already touched on the system. Then you have to look at the environment, how does that change? Usually we are talking about climate change, but the human-centered part of it. People are the ones who is actually contributing. Why? Because they're burning the forests, and when you take the forests and desertify the area, you are also diminishing the evaporation or the perspiration of water into the rain. So you are actually undermining your own system. Too many settlements. You have got, if you go to the country, you have got villages that 5 kilometers apart. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. But nobody seems to be doing anything about it. So you have got also these ones. You have got a lot of other problems, including the transhumant part of it, the movements. We used to go from the coast all the way to the center of the Somali region 5 and back. And now just move not more than, the longest they can move is like 50 kilometers. Because the land tenure is being changing. They cannot anymore. They have got these transboundary issues, which is not necessarily very easy for them. They have, and while they don't consider transboundary as an issue, it is there. It affects them very seriously. It has got taxes that was not there. It was always there. It was always there. But still, it's not as easy, because you can be taxed in Somaliland, you can be taxed in Ethiopia or Djibouti or Somalia, the rest of Somalia, wherever you are. So by the time you are crossing all these ones, the issue is who owns this livestock. The issue of trying to find both these things and make sure that ownership is also another big problem. So there's a huge competition among countries now to make sure that all this livestock is coming from Region 5. No, it's not coming. It's for Somaliland only. No, it's Somalia only. You never know, because they are crossing, these people are crossing. So this is another issue. And then nobody seems to be providing the social services they need. The water systems, pasture, all these things are not there. So they have to fend for themselves, which is becoming problematic. The other things we are looking to do is, how do we make pastoralism or pastoral economy more productive than what it is today? Because the returns, the population, the young generation are moving out. Why? Because the returns are not as good as they used to be. You don't have a lot of resources coming back from the livestock. If you look at the value chains of the livestock, if you look at the fodder, for example, or milk production and milk markets, if you look at all the hides and skins, anything that is, the producer has got the least money than the end markets. So you see people are selling this livestock small, very like maximum of $60 or $30 or $40. But you go to Saudi Arabia or even to Hargeisa. Last Eid it was $300 for some per head. So you see, they are not getting the type of returns they used to have. The systems are changing because they rear this livestock for export. Then Saudi Arabia comes and bans the whole thing. So you end up not having no markets anymore. And the market competitions are becoming. If you look at the taxes, the sheep, one sheep, if you look at it, from wherever it's coming to the port of Berbera, there are $7 on top of that, overhead of that sheep. And it makes it very expensive. It's not really helping people. So the people has got a lot of problems. Then they are also doing other things because they are burning charcoal. They're desertifying the land. There are too many cars going, so the water is runoffs are too many. You have got transport everywhere, so this car starts going all over the place, creating, so you will have your own, your water running away instead of settling down. You have got huge floods everywhere sometimes, and then 2 months later you don't have any water. So the whole management system, the whole natural resource management system is not there. And that's also big problems that we really have. I think if you look at these things, we also have got encroachment. You have got extractive industries coming in on the same land as pastoralists, agriculture or crop production is coming in, towns and small villages are coming in. So the land that was supposed to be allocated, or the range land management systems, are not in place. Because that's so important. And the way that works is they used to have this, let's say the seasonal reserves used to be something like, you have this whole like 700 square kilometers of land, and then what you do is you close down at the rainy seasons completely. You let the land rejuvenate itself. You have a lot of grass. Everybody will graze somewhere else. So at the dry season, everybody came there to graze that one. So it was it was helping livestock or the people not to have that much drought at all, because you have it. There's called something seasonal. That was seasonal. Then you have got the drought ones. The drought reserves were completely blocked unless there is there's only one in the country I know now in Arori. Everywhere else we are not doing it. So what we need is to close that down. And then you have permanent ones. The permanent ones usually were in the forests. So you can graze, but you cannot settle down. And you make sure that there's also the rangers who look after these ones. But now if you look at what's going on, the situation is that the governance system is also broken down. Because the hair, the precedents, things that was supposed to be helping is not there anymore. And government has got the right policies, and even if they have, they are not enforcing it. One of the amazing things that I always look at is we have quite a large number of rangers everywhere. We call it rangers in the by Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. But nobody's using them. They take salaries, they are there everywhere. They're not being functional in reality, so that can be done. So the whole policy system, whether they have, it is in climate change, whether it is range land management, whether it is how do you, the water development or water sources development or rehabilitations, nothing is being done seriously. People are talking about, we have got all types of laws and regulations and acts everywhere, but nobody's using it. The same thing with wildlife, everything is, so you see, it is like people have to do it themselves, and then the lifestyle changed. Complete lifestyle. If you go to the countryside, they're not different from the towns. The type of food they eat, the type of clothes they take, the way they behave, it's not any more pastoralists that we knew before. But there are a lot of opportunities if you really want to revive. The problems are money. Mainly it's human-made, many of them. Some of them are the climate change coming in, because you have got, for some, we never used to have cyclones in our part of the world. Or even if we have, it was like once in 50 years. Now we have got cyclones in the country. You have got recurrent droughts coming in all the time. And that destroys the vegetation and biodiversity in the area. You have see a lot of other invasive trees coming in into the system, replacing the traditional palatable grass. So things are moving not really the right direction, actually in the wrong direction. And we don't seem to be having a grasp on reverse that one. So this is one of the problems. But there are a lot of opportunities. One of the other things that's missing is the investment. Government make huge amount of money for livestock export. They do, and the livestock taxes, but they don't put it back anything. So we need to come up with investment systems that really help pastoral people or the livestock owners or holders or whatever you want to call them to get something out of what is going on in terms of development of the nation. We have not doing that. Now everybody was thinking about, value chain, value chain. Value chain means you have to diversify the economy. And to diversify your economy, you have to look at not only the livestock that's going from this place to that place, whether it be in local markets or international markets, but you have to also look at what else can we do. So we have got the milk, and we have milk trade, which is very, good in the country. We are thinking about further development systems is everywhere, and you still have because we are an exporting country, livestock exporting country. There is a lot of further farms and further ways, a lot of further banks and everywhere else. We need to really look at it, how we change from herders to animal husbandry. Look at more than just rearing that livestock, going after it, but also looking at to make it productive. You don't have to have 1,500 herds of sheep. You can have 300, but that 300 has to be more effective in terms of production. And in terms of returns, it has to be better than what we have this huge one. So, and a lot of people were saying, oh, livestock has been completely diminished, so there's not, there is. Because when I was growing up, my family was like, my uncles were 5. Now we are of 100, 200 people. So how many of us in the town? If you look at it, 70% are still in the countryside. They may not have 1,500 herds of livestock as we used to have, but they still have 200, 300, 400, 150, 60, 70. Add that one up, it's more than it was. So if this is the population, the demography is changing, both in terms of human and livestock. People are increasing in number, livestock is increasing in number, and the environment is degrading seriously. So you don't have nothing is going up the same one. It actually crosses itself. That's why the effects of climate change is hitting us very hard. That's why, one of the things. So if we want to change that, we have to come up with solutions and policies and programs, investment systems that really can reverse. We have to have, our education systems are really bad because it brings people from the countryside to the town and just want to be a white collar thing. We want to make education more relevant to the production systems on the ground, and we're not doing that one. My time is running up, but I think we can also have right policies in place, which we are not doing it. We have to have this transhuman and transboundary issues. We have got the regional policies that really governs how these livestock are going on. And we can easily reverse, as I believe, but on the effects of climate change if we really have got the right policies in place. I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saadia. That was really, really good. And I learned a lot about what she said. And when I said they know a lot, that's what I meant. They know a lot. So I hope you're taking notes. So our next speaker, as you see from our title, is the climate change and how it's impacting culture and heritage. So our next speaker is Huda Ali Banfas, and she is a photographer and she has traveled many places, and she's into art and culture and also wildlife, and she knows how climate change is basically evolving and changing culture and heritage. So hopefully you will learn a lot, and some of the pictures, she has a book called Kate, and some of the pictures that she took a while ago is this picture. You could see how basically birds and humans and animals are literally fighting over the water. So hopefully she will say a lot about what she's doing back home, and also explain how this has changed how we see the environment. Thank you so much. Welcome, Huda.
Thank you very much, Ubah. My name is Huda Ali Banfas. I'm from Hargeisa, Somaliland. This is my first time in London. Yeah, as she said, I call myself a woman with so many hats, or sometimes scarves. Yeah, I did my background from the education-wise was my first degree was criminal justice and police, criminology in general, and then my second degree was international relations and politics, and then my master's was international relations and diplomacy, all in Somaliland. So I'm currently working with a non-profit organization based in Hargeisa. It's called Heritage Somaliland. That's why I'm here in this session. One of the two things we work and the areas we work is the natural and cultural heritage in the Horn of Africa and especially in Somaliland. What's going on in Horn of Africa? Like, whenever everybody here is outside the continent or outside the Horn, all that comes to your mind could be the droughts or like these frequent droughts that happens every year. That's one of the issues which is also causing a climate change in the Horn of Africa. As I was working with the different organizations based in Somaliland, I want to see and look at the side of like what's happening there and what is there any organizations doing something about it. Yes, there are different organizations, international and local ones, who are working to do something about the climate change in the Horn of Africa. But the question is to find a solution for these problems that currently exist in the Horn of Africa. Do Somalis need a foreign investment, or do they need a foreign funding to fix this problem? I don't think it is. I think the Somalis can find ways to help their Somalis find to reduce the things they're doing on the ground, which is also contributing on what's happening also the rest of the world. I believe only a healthy environment can adapt a climate change or changing climates. Everywhere in Somaliland and in the Horn, specifically in Somaliland and Puntland, if you go there, you can see that one of the main problems is also the charcoal burning or like burning the trees, which I myself have seen it in the field in south of Hargeisa on my own eyes, and in Sahel region in Somaliland and Togdheer and other places in the Horn. This thing is also destroying the beautiful environment and the trees cover. Because whenever I go through, because I usually read more in a poetry side of Somalis, because my father was a poet. And when I go through and read his poems and the other poets' artistic works, all I see is a beautiful environment. They're talking about the forests. They're talking about the big animals that exist. They're talking about the animals that used to exist 40 or 50 years ago or 60 years ago in Somaliland, in the places that today I visit and I make the whole book of photography. These places, like if you see how beautiful they describe the untouched forests, and now when I go back and I see, it's totally different worlds. It's totally different worlds. Because the charcoal that you usually hear from the media, or maybe like when you go back home, you heard that like it's used for households. There's also another trend which is not just using in the households of Somalis. It's also the case of exporting the charcoal from Horn of Africa, especially from Somalia and from Somaliland. And this happens, and I think Saadi and the experts also knows this. This is not only a problem that we are just losing the trees, but we are also losing this heritage. The trees we have is in burnt form, now going out of the continent, of the Horn. Is there any initiatives or any efforts also towards on this that's now happening in Somalis, or in the field, or I mean in Somali areas? Yes, some organizations were doing something. They were not doing, of course, everything, but there's some initiatives coming from international organizations. When I go back 2 years ago now, when I was working with GIZ, GIZ is a governmental organization. It's a German governmental organization that works in Horn of Africa, especially in Ethiopia, Puntland, Somaliland. When I was working with them in their sustainable land management project, we were providing the local community or poor communities with what we call it alternative cooking energy. We provided liquid gas, like 1,000 households, and also kerosene stoves. What we did was, after we gave them, in 3 months, we tried to test how like these families are coping without just using the bags of charcoals they used to. So we discovered that, for example, a family who was using 3 packs of charcoal, like after they use a month, they was just using 10 liters of kerosene stove, or like only like 2 times of liquid gas. So you can see the difference, like this is small thing which like one organization did. It was not only GIZ, there was also some initiatives from UNDP who are also working with Ministry of Environment in Somaliland. Charcoal is a business in these Somali areas. So like there's like business people involved, there's some community elders also involved. So if this goes on, then we're going to be in hell. There's also like my personal experience of the droughts in Somaliland. I remember in 2016 and 2017, I was working in different organizations. We were in the coastline of Somaliland, close to Djibouti, and the other side close to Ethiopia. There was like severely affected areas. One of the interesting things I saw was I have seen families who left their children, like children, with the strangers in some places, because they were worried if they take the children with them, then they will die on the way. Or they were worried that like they can't go, and if they go a long distance places to find water, and then they don't find water, then the children will die there. So they left behind these places. And I was in charge or assigned to register these children in these areas. So like the organizations that I was working with can also provide some support. But the question is like, how much can this also help? Which maybe in the other discussions we can also ask, like, how much can these efforts, small efforts coming from international organizations, can also help, like the mass affected areas of environment? When I go specifically the impact of climate change on heritage, it's also like the natural environment is now under destruction. This cutting of trees and the charcoal is also like problem. But now a new trend of a problem is coming from this side of Horn of Africa. Recently I was in Puntland and I was in Somaliland. And I have seen that there's another crazy thing going on in the field when it comes to the forest and the natural trees. There was now live trees that we're cutting and exporting out. It's not the charcoal thing now. It's not the pine trees are going out. It's the live trees also going out. There was some now recent ongoing case in court in Puntland where people who were doing this were now in court. There's also confiscations happening in eastern side of Somalia, which is bordering Puntland. So this is also another disaster which is coming in the forest side of the land. There's also the sandstorms. There's sandstorms in the coastal areas where these historical archaeological heritage sites are. So we are losing these places. When you go far east of Somaliland, in close to Hiis, which is next to Maid, there's now, you can see the effect of the sandstorms. It's now the houses, everything is just going down. We're soon going to lose them. Like we lost in some areas of East Sahel region, east of Berbera. And also like the West Sahel, which is Bulahar, which is the historical sites that exist. But when I see the difference between my trips from 2016 or 17s and now in 2020s, you can see the difference, like that these historical sites are also like going away. There's also now in a village in Puntland, it's called Dinauda. I don't know if one of you is following the latest news from there in this year, in 2 months ago. It's also, the whole town is just like it's losing. If you go now and Google it, Dinauda in Puntland, you can see how like sandstorms is now damaging the whole town. And people has to be rescued from there. Also the cyclones that happened in 2016s and 17s in parts of Somaliland, in the eastern side, which is the coastline, we have also lost some sites from these cyclones in the archaeological sites and historicals. There's also the side which I also work, which is the environment, especially the animals and especially the wild animals. They're also suffering from this loss of trees and forest, like Saadi earlier explained. And the expanding of plots, which like sometimes the farmers go beyond the plots they used to have and fenced enclosures around where the animals or wild animals previously used to exist. There's also now another problem which is also happening in some parts of Sahel region and Senak, which is mining or like gold digging activities which is going on there. There's a lot of like damaging things going on there because the people who are mining these mountains, especially Sahel and Senak, are not professionals. It's like people like me, it's people like this who use, like Saadi explained, that their whole culture changed now. They have interesting small machines which they bought it from the towns or sometimes outside Somaliland. And then everybody's trying to find gold everywhere. And this is also like destroying the soil and sometimes opening the new channels where like the floods now goes and damaging the forests. So I think to conclude, I think what we need in these Somali communities in the Horn of Africa is that there must be sustainable adaptation plans or like recovery plans or resilient plans. We should also have some education and awareness raising of the prevention of the things that's contributing, like the ones now I have mentioned, to climate change. Because sometimes when you ask Somali person who's not following like this academia part, they will just say, like when you ask them, what do you know about climate change? They will just tell you it's a curse. Like some communities make some sins. And I don't think there's a sin, there's no sin bigger than like taking the forest down, taking the environment and change and everything and export everything out. So I think there must be some preparedness about the early warnings, and that there must be some like, because sometimes Somali people are like cultural people, so they sometimes stick to some land where they believe that ancestors were there a long time ago. So sometimes they don't usually evacuate before the problems happen, before the cyclones happen, before the droughts happen. So there must be some preparedness about that also. And we must find also unemployment opportunities. Because these people who are trying to export the charcoal, trying to export live trees, trying to make this like unprofessionally, like making their own mind programs, there must be some other employment opportunities where people can go. Because I don't think cash which is provided by international organizations for just 1 month or 2 months is going to solve the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Huda. If you have any questions for Huda, please ask later. She will be more than happy to answer. Our next speaker is our Professor Laura Hammond, who is a professor of development studies and the co-director of the Center of Migration and Diaspora at SOS. Thank you.
Thanks, Uba. And nice to be here. Very nice to be on a panel of all women. I was looking at some of the photographs of Somali Week. They're fantastic, but there's not that many women until now. I find this is where they all are. And also difficult already to follow. I'm not the last speaker, but I'm already finding it difficult to know an original thing to say because already Sadia and Huda have given us such rich presentations and things to think about. So I wanted to just speak a little bit about some work that I've been involved in over the last several years, including most recently with some colleagues who some of you may know. Just a background of me, I started working in Somali areas in the mid-1990s through Ethiopia and Somali region. And then I lived in Hargeisa in 1998, so my time there goes back a long ways. And then most recently I've been running a research center which is funded by the European Union, and it works across the whole Horn of Africa, including all of the Somali territories and other places as well, the Sudan, Uganda, etc. So what I wanted, remarks I wanted to make are partly drawn from my own work. I've done some work, as I'll discuss, on urban displacement in Somalia and Somaliland. And also then just to refer to some new work that's just coming out from our research center that's been led by Mohammed Fadel from Suradi in Hargeisa and Abdurrahman Ahmed from the University of Jigjiga, who've both been looking at the impact of climate change and the recent drought on migration patterns and migration decision making. So that's a very new research. It hasn't even come out yet, so I've just been reading through the drafts of their reports to see what tidbits I can pull out for you tonight. You'll get the first sneak preview of some of that. But so I guess I wanted, because my work tends to focus on migration and displacement, I'm thinking about the ways in which environmental change, not just drought, but the broader processes of environmental change have influenced people's livelihoods and people's thinking about moving or staying put. And we've seen, as has already been said tonight, that these processes of movement and mobility have been in play for quite a long time. People move, they sometimes move hoping that their movements will be temporary and they'll be able to return to their communities of origin. Unfortunately, sometimes they find that those moves end up being permanent because it's not possible to go back to particularly to rural livelihoods. And you see, for those of you who have been in any of the largest cities in Somali territories, that there are large numbers of displaced people in just about every city living on the edges of the city, and they're somehow what we might call peripheral or almost trapped populations because they're not fully able to integrate into the urban environment, to take advantage of what it might mean to live in the city, be an urban resident. They can't rent houses, they can't find jobs very easily, they can't access services. And yet at the same time, it's not possible for them to return to their rural livelihoods. And so they really remain stuck. And some of them for many years. I mean, if you think about in Hargeisa, for instance, the people in the State House area, some of them have been there since before I ever turned up in the late 1990s, since the mid-1990s when they first came back from Ethiopia after the destruction of Hargeisa, and they're still living there. So this is an issue. And some of the work that I've been doing has been trying to understand the experience of that displacement and how it relates to climate change. A few years ago, we did a study looking at urban displacement, particularly in Somaliland, and went into that research really not making any assumptions about why people had moved, but asked them why had they moved. And in fact, climate changes and drought turned out to be the major reason that they had moved. And in some cases, they had lost all of their animals and then moved into the city. In other cases, they had left a few out in the countryside for some relatives to take care of, and then they had moved in. And they shared resources back and forth between the city and the rural countryside. But what has often been the case, and I think Sadia made this point really well, is that the moves in, although the hope is that they'll be temporary, they become quite permanent, and it becomes really very difficult for them to return. So my first kind of point is trying, in our work, we try to counter some of the popular myths around the relationship between climate change and movement. And so very often, from the very far-off vantage point of the UK, for instance, or European media centres, you hear the argument that climate change unleashes, this terrible language that's used, unleashes floods of people that will move long distances from the Horn of Africa towards Europe, for instance. And that is, of course, not at all the case. People who move, as we've already been discussing tonight, tend to move as a last resort when they're economically at their most desperate, and they tend to move very short distances. They don't have not only do they not have the economic ability to move longer distances, but very often they have not the ambition either. They want to stay close to home. They want to be able to return as quickly as they can. So they go to the nearest town, the nearest city. Maybe they cross an international border to a refugee camp or some other place where there's support available, but they're not people who are crossing the entire continent of Africa and then the Mediterranean Sea and then all of Europe to end up in Calais or in Dover. That's a different group of people who are moving, and they tend to be more middle class, more educated, more urbanized in the first place. So that's a kind of trying to debunk some of that thinking. In the work that my colleagues Mohammed Fadel and Abdurrahman Ahmed have done, Abdurrahman was working in Kebrabaya, in Aubere and Jigjiga areas, and Fadel was working in Togdere and Moradijeh districts as well, and looking at the broader impact of the ways in which climate change has affected them. But of course, they were doing it in the midst of the drought. And I know from past experience that working in those kind of environments can be extremely difficult. In fact, in 2017, when we were working on urban displacement, we just stopped the research and started sending tankers of water into the community because it was not ethical, really, to continue doing this research. So they've been working under really difficult kind of circumstances. But some of the things that they found is that although there is urbanization, people are moving into cities, they are really importantly keeping some of their ties to the rural areas. And to the extent that one might think about how do you respond to drought, or how do you respond to people who are affected by drought, it's important not to just focus on those who have moved, but also those who have stayed behind, who are in many cases holding up the homestead or the family farm in order to hopefully restart their activities once the drought's passed. They've spent a lot of time talking to both men and women and found that in most cases the decision about whether or not to move is made by men, sometimes in consultation with women in the family, but very often not, which, as many women here will know, is a little bit ironic because in fact it's women who prepare the move and make the move happen. Sometimes in the first periods of drought, people move short distances together as a family, but then sometimes they'll also have to split up, which places more pressure on women to become the bread earners while men are taking the animals, for instance, to further grazing areas or looking for work in further off cities. So there's a real a differentiation by gender according to the experience of climate change and drought on these different communities. Sometimes we have, maybe this will come up in the discussion questions about, are we looking at the end of pastoralism? And I was glad to see, Sadia, that you're saying no, but that pastoralism is changing. Yes, you might need to have smaller herds, as you suggested, and also more diversification of livelihoods so that there is some wage labor and there's some agricultural production, if that's possible, and some movement around as well. But that also supplements the pastoral livelihoods. And that in this part of the world, one has to recognize that pastoralism still does provide a really important kind of backbone to the overall sort of livelihood systems. But it's going through important changes, and we need to be aware of those changes. Just as an example, Abdurrahman's work looks at how people share information about where the good grazing land is or where the water sources are. And whereas previously they used to send scouts out to travel long distances to look for that information, now they share it by WhatsApp groups and mobile phones and other kinds of things. So people are adapting in really strong ways. It's really important that we focus on some of the strong forms of resilience and the positive ways in which people have been adapting in addition to the suffering that's been involved in responding to drought. And about one of Mohammed Fadel's findings when he talks about some of the impact on pastoralism, and we talk about dwindling herd sizes, we're talking in many cases in Somaliland about reduction of maybe 2/3 of the size of a herd. So whereas 6 years ago, many pastoralists who had 200 to 300 sheep and goats now have between 60 to 100. And those who had between 30 and 60 really now have either anywhere between 0 and 10 animals. So quite significant reductions, but still engaging to some extent, if they can, in pastoral activity. I don't know if people have heard the term, but people, Fadel was reporting that many people refer to this current drought by using the term SEMA, or the equalizer, because it means that it affects all people equally, and no one is able to escape the effects of the drought. Just as a final kind of thing, I'm thinking about some of the impacts and some of the ways in which some of the the difficulties that this recurrent, more frequent kinds of drought has, not just on people's livelihood systems, but on governance systems more broadly. And you find a real lack of forward planning. And the point was made that the taxation that's derived from the sale of livestock is often not put back into any kind of a preparedness or response mechanism for drought action. And that's really true. And that's something that really has got to change. There's a lack of forward planning, a lack of thinking about what kinds of alternative income generation activities could be provided that would offset the need to create charcoal or to overgraze a particular area of land, to try to counteract the vulnerability, but also to try to generate a disaster response that isn't just short term. Very often you have these quite ad hoc committees that are formed, sometimes by religious leaders, which makes sense in a way because people trust them and they're willing to give them their money. But they're not people who are able to professionally lead a drought response. There's not really a systematized kind of infrastructure for developing disaster policy response mechanisms and looking at that in a longer term way. The one exception to that actually is in Ethiopia, where it doesn't always happen as well as it should in Somali region, but nationally, Ethiopia has a very well-developed early warning system and a disaster prevention and preparedness policy. Since the early 1990s, they've had one. And they have the capacity, and they've shown they have the capacity to prevent famines from happening, should they want to. Sometimes political will gets in the way, and they don't respond as rapidly or as robustly, as we all know, in Somali regions and in other lowland areas as they do in their highlands. But the system is in place, and there's maybe something that could be learned from that in other parts, in other Somali areas as well. So I'll just leave it there and hope that we can have time for a discussion later on after our last speaker.
Thank you so much, Professor Laura. Our last speaker is Fozia.
Hello. Can everybody hear me? My name is Fozia Abdelkader, and long-time policy person. Climate change is something new, but I think I'm glad that I am speaking at the end because the breadth and the complexity of what is going on has been touched on from different dimensions. And what I would like to focus is on the pastoralists, and particularly the Somali region in Ethiopia, about climate change, and bringing in not just Band-Aid solutions, but a systems way to address the impact it's having. I think Simon is the right word. It's impacting the communities across the Horn and many parts of Africa similarly. But I would still argue that there is uneven impact when it comes to pastoralism and the people who are pastoralists and the way it impacts them. So climate change is real. Hard to believe there are deniers still out there, but it is real. And climate change and its resulting environmental shocks, such as the cyclical droughts, which I want to kind of focus on, but flooding as well, right? You would have rain seasons failing one after the other, and then it rains, and then there is flood, and then you have to now save people and animals from the flooding. There is also famine, right? So the impact of the climate shocks is variant. And the important part of it is to really recognize how unevenly it impacts communities and what are the underlying issues of this climate instability that is becoming the norm now. Like I remember, just to date myself, I remember the 74 drought. There used to be kind of like 10 years before you would hear another drought. Now it is getting ridiculously close to each other. It's not even 4 years anymore. We remember the 2011 fundraising for it all over the place, 2016, 17, Now, so it's sort of like, and I was talking to somebody when Ayan asked me to come, I started meeting people in the Somali region offices, and you know, the preparedness, forget the preparedness, the response is still ongoing. There are 5 rain seasons consecutively that have failed now. So people have been becoming, especially pastoralists, vulnerable. But you can only imagine at the Somali region scene, they managed to save lives, not the animals, but people didn't die. But now that you have the 5th rain falling, failing to come, and people have been vulnerable for 5 seasons, you can only imagine now the health and lack of nutrition and all the rest of it. So I think we know what the issues are. The responses is where it's lacking, and I'm glad Saadia talked about this. The way we are responding to it needs some paradigm shift. We need to really shift the focus. For one thing, there's no lack of literature and research in addressing complex issues, right? When you really think about complex problems, which climate change, droughts, whatever have you, are, what you need to do is basically develop a common understanding. It's like, you know, we've been battling preventing smoke in public places, smoking for years. When there is a population level issue that you need to address programmatically and policy-wise, you need to have civil society, policy people, politicians, everybody understanding this monster of a complex issue the same way. So we can all push the same direction, right? Like it has to come to that. One of the books that I really liked reading when it comes to social interventions at a population level is a book called Getting to Maybe, because social issues and development issues are going to be with us for a while. So when you get to that maybe now, the system is aligned. Maybe now we can push the same direction. There is a book called Getting to Maybe, How the World is Changed. So you want to create that, and it's by Francis Wesley, Brenda Zimmerman, and Michael Quinn-Batten in Canada and the US. And what they talk about in that sort of addressing complex issues is to really employ complexity theory, which is really, you know, kind of common sense if you think about it. It harvests the experience of wide range of people and organizations. Saadia and I earlier were talking about enough is enough. We can't all be busy in one corner doing something by ourselves. It's time to bring it together, to bring all those efforts so that we can get the critical mass out there. So really what complexity theory and insights that we can learn is harvesting those wide community-based advocacy organizations such as Kate here, we are here, yeah? Bringing that and looking at who's doing what where and really linking and collaborating so that, you know, in this book they talk about studying the innovation that is everywhere from real life experiences and examples to change through a system and relationships lens. So these authors of Getting to Maybe may reveal something we already know, but the rules of engagement between volunteers, leaders, organizations, circumstances between individuals and communities, this is what we need to bring to the fore, because we're all tired. We're all doing community development every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Like it's happening. But why is it not working? Because the systems are not linked. And the politicians are in one window, and the volunteers and the community-based organizations are in another table. Market people are somewhere else. Decisions are being made without really informing each other. So I think books like Getting to Maybe, what we need to do is look at this from a systems approach. Because we know what's happening to the pastoralists. We have seen it. We cry over it. People are losing lives. So to me, to repeat it again, it's a paradigm shift. And particularly when I think about paradigm shift being needed in the Somali region. I think Laura just mentioned how Ethiopia has a system. Well, when you are in the Somali region, you're not in Ethiopia. You're part of Ethiopia, but you're not really. So, so what you need to realize in that context, for me, the Somali region is, Ethiopia is over 100 million people. And the pastoralist communities are a tiny bit compared to the rest of the people. So the state machinery and the state technology and the state research sponsors are all focusing on the larger populations of the country. So you've got the Afar region, the Somali region, part of Oromia region having pastoralists, and they are totally forgotten. I was shocked to find out that Ethiopia, as a country that existed so many years, their pastoral development program and policy is few years old. And guess what? It resides in the Ministry of Peace. So it's securitized. These people at the fringes of the country need to be curtailed, right? So it is, pastoral development as such is really not in the center and the mainstream focus, which is why, somebody like me who's not interested, hasn't been doing research on climate change, looking at the people and looking at the disparity and how marginalized communities like the Afar and the Somalis are being neglected in the mainstream Ethiopian public policy making. I think focusing on a paradigm shift. To add to the paradigm shift, we have, and we all know, food security. Places that are food insecure, people try to put in place food security policies. And so to kind of give you a basic definitions, food security is, of course, simply put, is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to food. Easy, right? So food security is making food available and accessible and economically affordable. However, from what we have seen, and from not even including the pastoralists in the way you're going to provide that little bit of wheat that you give them in the middle of nowhere, or create those 5 kilometers in between municipalities to sedentarize pastoralists and then give them a sack of rice or a sack of, it's not food security that really works. So to me, in diving into this, I came across concept that is food sovereignty. So using a food sovereignty lens, right, on the other hand, we can understand it, just to give you a simple, food sovereignty can be understood as the right and responsibility of people to have access to healthy and culturally appropriate foods while defining their own food systems. The contradictions of, you get your milk and you get your ghee and you get your meat in a cheap way from the pastoralists, but then when you're reselling it, that value chain doesn't really go back to the communities, but they should be part of that system. So a food sovereignty framework will allow for, those of us in public policy, for the assessment of specific gaps in, nobody talks to pastoralist women, right? So gender gaps in the programs you're creating, cultural, and also histories, right? You need to take into consideration all these things. So it'll allow you to then highlight those existing gaps in the current food security framework systems that we're using. So interventions, right? Climate change, big problem, all the way to the, people's livestock dying. At a public policy level, interventions should be informed by a food sovereign approach, which will principally seek to strengthen pastoralist sovereignty. I spoke to the World Food Program office in Addis Ababa, and they provide and spend money. And in an honest way, the lady who was there said, we never include the pastoralists in how we are designing what we're doing. Nobody talks to the pastoralists. We just go and distribute some money or some food to them, but it is not inclusive. So a food sovereign sort of lens, I think, and a policy will help us to seek strengthening pastoralist sovereignty rather than create government dependency, which is what happens in the Somali region. So it's going to be making the pastoralist quality of life at the center in its outputs and outcomes, and privileges indigenous knowledge. People have been doing pastoralism since time immemorial, right? So they have had climate change, they have dealt with it. Yes, it needs to be a little bit, I hate that word, to be modernized, but still, they have indigenous ways of coping, and nobody is really documenting that. So indigenous knowledge, practices of nourishing the environment that pastoralists are de facto the stewards of, yeah? So we all know the frequent and the prolonged weather episodes, such as the droughts, floods, becoming the norm, right? Rather than the exception. And also becoming the norm in countries that are food insecure, like Ethiopia, where arid and semi-arid pastoral areas comprise of almost 60% of the total land area of the country. Yet again, pastoralism is neglected in their policies. So although rural pastoral development initiatives like the productive safety net have emerged as a vital component of Ethiopia's climate adaptation strategy to ensure food security in the Somali regional state, there are two glaring omissions. The first one being, as I said, pastoralist communities are neglected. And worse yet, they are homogenized as if they are just one group, and or considered an ancillary, and the efforts go into sedentizing them, how to make them sit in one village, yeah? So you can tell them to till the land and become agriculturalists, which leave their sort of adaptation practices relatively unexamined. The second part that is missing also is there is less known about pastoral women's perceptions of climate adaptation and coping strategies. As a highly vulnerable demographic, the data deficit on pastoralist lifestyles and livelihoods calls for the need to invest in research capacity that supports climate-smart pastoral development ever more urgently. Saadia mentioned resilient systems, systems that can predict so that you can save livestock and people and plan for it. So we need initiatives that will employ a decolonial political ecology lens to critically assess how pastoralists interact with their environment through specific political and economic constellations that are impacting them, and also analyzing the power relations. In the context of Ethiopia, pastoralists are really not in the mainstream, the center of the country's development agenda. So you need initiatives, for example, because we can always highlight the problems, but you need initiatives that have the intended outcomes of maybe basically starting with profiling pastoral households, inter and intra matrices that reveal details about pastoral livelihood systems. We need to start thinking about systems, evidence-based mechanisms to benchmark the needs support for pastoral households, talking to them, right? Not just deciding a sack of rice will do and a jerry can of salid, cooking oil, and examining the extent to which gaps in policies and legislations exist to reveal biases against pastoral livelihood systems. Robust risk management and effective drought predicting systems also need. This is all known. And I was like, okay, so why? Oh, the system was developed by EU a few years back. It's in Addis Ababa, nobody can access it. Maybe there is no know-how to access it. Maybe the database is dated. You know, there are systems and data that was collected that is sitting in Addis Ababa about the Somali region that no one can access. So again, that robust risk management, tangible cultural and ideological shift in bureaucratic and public domains regarding the productivity and viability of pastoralism in the era of climate change. Pastoralism is not going to go away. And climate change is becoming shockingly real in every corner of the world. So it is incumbent of offices and responsible people to now spend a little bit more money in understanding pastoral way of life and creating that resilient systems livelihood. One thing that the needle is moving, as I said, a few years ago, Ethiopia said, oh, we need a pastoral development policy. Good. However weak or whatever ineffective it is, at least there is a policy now. It's just moving it out of the security sector and bringing it to the development sector. The United Nations named 2026 the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, which is a good international move. And the Food Agency, FAO, is the lead agency on initiatives to raise awareness on the importance and pastoralists and rangelands. So the experiences from the panel today alone, if we compile that and tell people who are making decisions about where to spend money and how to develop communities, I am hoping, the UN is such a big bureaucratic mess, but I think I'm hoping now that at least there is a year of pastoralism and rangeland. Some resources will be directed in the development. So that is the bit of a literature piece that I did, and maybe now I can share some numbers because the problem is real and about real people's lives. So I went to the various bureau heads. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up soon. I just want to talk about the Somali regional state and some of the efforts that are being done. Of course, they are in this continuous reoccurring drought response, emergency response, and for whatever it's worth, not many people died in the last year and a half droughts. Now, with people being more vulnerable and lost most of their livestock, now diseases are breaking out. Now there is also shortage. So in this nice infographic, they are doing their work. They are capturing data. There are about 5.4 million people in the population that are impacted. They are targeting to reach 3.8, which is not bad with their meager resources. However, and this is the catch, the funding that is required is over 600 million, and all they have is 200 million. So you can only see how dire the situation is in terms of what it is that they can really provide. In terms of trucking, they've been trucking water, they've been trying to reach, 3.6 million people were in need of water, they reached 2. Drought-affected zones are sort of like in the multiple. There are 11 zones, and there are over 90 villages, what are those? So there's a whole lot of them that are in need. What is happening now is people who have lost their livestock are coming into the bigger villages or the bigger cities. So internally displaced that you were talking about, there are people now who are on top of people who had meager resources to begin with. And IDPs are over 400,000 people. So there is a need to, back in June, we did a fundraiser where we kind of worked with the religious leaders, the, mostly men political leaders, to try and raise awareness. We're still continuing to do that. But as you can see, the government is trying. They have what they call the good assessment, which is one of the raining seasons, and then they have the Dair analysis. So now they're telling me this is the 5th raining season that is failing. And imagine, people are more vulnerable now. So there's gonna be health needs, there's gonna be nutrition, there's gonna be children and elderly that would need health and nutrition. So not to be the bearer of bad news, but it's real bad news. So I'm gonna stop there. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Fosia. If you have any questions for our panelists, or if you have a general question, please ask. I will also request if all of them could come here, so they could at least face you. And I think I agree with what Fosia said. I think indigenous knowledge is very important to this issue. And usually we don't hear from the local community. But also, I think this issue is beyond the Somali region or the Horn of Africa. So I think going back to the climate justice and whose responsibility is to ensure that those local communities are being protected. I think we have to ask ourselves whose responsibility is. Is it the local communities or the local governments, or it's the international actors or international NGOs who's supposed to protect the local communities? So that's like my general comment. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and then I will give you the mic.
All right, okay, hello everyone. I really enjoyed this speech. Thank you for the speakers. You've touched on a lot of subjects. And also, I would like to say personally, Laura, I studied at SOAS, Migration, Mobility and Development. Didn't really finish it, I'm coming back. But yeah, so one of the questions I wanted to raise was like, we all talk about how it affects Africa, how it affects Somalia, what we can do, what are the solutions, but we really don't talk about how the external community, so how the North and global emissions actually affect the climate and environmental degradations in the global South, and what we can do as like a global community to make sure that it doesn't really just impact the South. So one of the things I thought about, and I mentioned it in my studies at SOAS again, but I mentioned the fact that countries that are high emitting pollution, they should be taxed. So that funding can be put together and help countries that are being affected by the global climate and environmental degradation caused by these factors. And thank you. And my name is Ladan Ahmed. Thank you very much.
Do you all feel is needed for perhaps international support, aid, intervention? How much, where you feel that role lies? Is it one that it would be the international community overstepping for getting involved, that you feel Somalia and Somaliland can manage with support? Where do you feel that role lies?
I am independent researcher, especially in Somalia. I have seen the drought, and I made an article on Hiran Online, from drought to the flood, which means there are two different episodes. My country needs a lot of work to deal with the drought, in my opinion. Starting from watershed development projects to stop the runoffs, and made a lot of infiltration to the ground. The second thing is to make water exploration research, because in my research I explored that Somalia has got 12,300 kilometer cubic of groundwater. The challenge is to find where they are and their quality. But we are number 14 in Africa. Number 1 is Libya, which has 91 kilometer cubic. Can you imagine how much 1 kilometer cubic? Can you imagine? 1 kilometer cubic is a lot of water. And we have got 12,300 kilometer cubic, ranking number 14 in the whole continent of Africa. In my opinion, I have spoken to number 1 in terms of water exploration. Alain Gachet is a French scientist. I spoke to him through telephone. Then he said, there is shallow water. It's not the time for shallow water. This time you have to go to the deep water, ranging from 300 meters and down. So a lot of Somali politicians, they don't know how to tackle these problems in advance. And I'm thanking for the panelists who have raised a lot of points which the country needs. Thank you.
She had is one of the reasons why the solutions or the possible future things that we could do about it aren't working is because of the fact that everybody has different, it's in different corners. So you have the people that are focusing on the local communities, you have the market side. So my question kind of was, how do you see the fact that there's so many different groups of people with different possible future outcomes that they would want, how would you basically make everyone come together in order for it to work? Because like I said, everybody has different things that they would want as the end goal. You have people that would want to make money out of certain situations, people where their main focus is the local communities, there's people in urban areas to where their main focus is maybe making the businesses thrive. So everybody has a different end goal. So what would be something, or how do you see it as basically kind of incentivizing people to, because even if we have solutions that we could do, it's very specific what people say. What we might do today, the effects of it, we won't notice until 20, 30 years down the line. So how do you convince people of trying solutions or coming up with things that would benefit the generations to come? Because like you said, the cycles are becoming shorter, but we want solutions that would not help us necessarily, but generations down the line. So how do you convince different groups of people with different things they want in order to make them see, hey, this is not for us, but for generations to come? And my name is Samir, by the way, so thank you.
Because I didn't had anything about related to technology. So could you, for example, come as an example, for example, how technology could mitigate this issue given the capacity and the economy and everything that we have? Thank you.
As we know, like the climate crisis isn't just about how it affects the planet. Because we live on the planet, it affects so many systems, us included. But I wanted to understand a little bit more, or maybe if you guys just wanted to point me in the direction of like where I could do more research into what is actually causing the like increased frequency of things that haven't been in our country before, like cyclones, as well as the increased frequency in droughts, as well as like the sandstorms and things like that. Just understanding kind of like the biological mechanisms behind why or how that's happening would be really interesting to find out more about. And secondly, I think when we were talking about it, like indigenous knowledge and how that might be useful, I usually find that when it comes to indigenous knowledge, it tends to be more sustainable in practice. So is there any kind of sort of effort to preserve those or use those kind of techniques to make a more like sustainable system moving forward? And a third question, I wanted to understand a little bit more about the policy in Somalia itself, because it's very interesting to hear about Ethiopia and how that impacts the Somali communities that live there. But what is policy like in Somalia regarding the climate crisis outside of kind of taxation? I just wanted to know a little bit more about that. It's a bit of a broad question, but thank you.
A lot of the questions touch on a similar thing, or at least maybe the answers to me. My answers are quite similar to several of the questions. I think really interesting questions. Thank you for those. But I mean, I think one of the questions was around global responsibility for climate change, and I think that person actually who asked the question is now gone, but it relates to other questions around what's the role of the international community as well. A lot of the conversations that are held, for instance, at the COP26 meeting that was held in Glasgow last year, there was hardly any conversation around human adaptation to climate change. It was about carbon emissions, about global warming, about how to bring that percentage down, but also about how to look for carbon credits, for instance. The Horn of Africa is a major source of carbon credits. I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but basically farmers are given a small amount of money not to farm an area. so that the carbon that is produced by what grows in that area, the bushland and the trees that will grow, can offset someone else's pollution somewhere else. That happens a lot in a lot of different places. And so that's the kind of conversation that's happening. It's not happening at all about migration and really not very much about food security. So we need to have much more. I mean, there's much more of a hope. There's been an interesting move by the African Cities Network that's trying to feed into the COP27 meetings that will be happening in Egypt later on, to try to make sure that there's much more conversation around urbanization and migration and those kinds of things. So maybe some things will start to change, but there's really not much of a conversation about it. The question around what's the role of the international community, it would be really interesting to hear what everyone has to say, because I'm sure we have all different things to say about it. But one of the problems, I think, is a sense of short-termism. So many international actors, particularly foreign governments, see Somalia as one undifferentiated whole, and they continue to see it as a site of insecurity and a place where development is not possible. So the kinds of assistance that are given are very short-term, even in terms of drought relief, is just food or cash to relieve immediate suffering. It's not about recovery from drought. It's not about the kind of development actions that need to take place in the long term, whether it's about infrastructure and introducing technology, or about creating a policy environment for Somali territories to be able to govern themselves and to set their priorities and to professionalize themselves in the way that, yes, it's not a perfect situation, but there is a policy framework that exists in Ethiopia. That's not really happening. And donors are not stepping up to say, we want to fund something like that. They really just want to rush in and rush out. So for me, it's all about short-termism, and that kind of touches on several different questions. The question around what happened, why are there more severe weather events? I mean, it has to do with increasing temperatures, which then increase sea level, which then change wind patterns, which then lead to increased serious weather events, as well as drought and this broad dynamic. But particularly in the whole kind of side of East Africa, from Mozambique right all the way up through to the Red Sea, it's repeatedly taken the form of El Nino and La Nina weather events that have wreaked havoc in terms of cyclones, in terms of droughts and desertification and quite severe other kinds of weather events. So there's lots more to say about that, but maybe in another event. But I think that, yeah, for me, the one of the real keys is that there's not much engagement either on that kind of infrastructural side to produce development solutions, or as well on a policy side. And you really need both of those things to take things forward. And I think, a lot of Somali administrations at various levels have put in place development plans and development priorities, and they suffer from a lack of funding, they suffer from a lack of commitment, they change every time a political leader changes. So it's also a shared responsibility. It's not something that the international community or the Somali administration can find a solution for, but really takes a working together. And the last thing I wanted to say was just that, since we're so many women in this group, that one of the places in Somali society where women really shine is in civil society, in NGOs, in local organizations, and there's a really strong role for women to play in making their voices heard about these kinds of issues. In Somaliland, the single female minister, is the Minister of Environment. She's very, very underfunded. Her ministry is one of the most poorly funded ministries in the administration, but that shouldn't be allowed to stand, and there has to be a lot of political, popular mobilization to ensure that her ministry is well resourced to be able to actually carry forth, this important work.
Thank you for some good questions. The global North's responsibility, and I think the person who asked that left, but I think climate change is happening to the people in the Horn of Africa, and they did not contribute to the emissions and the rest of it that actually brings it. So it is definitely there needs to be a global responsibility for it, and the global North needs to take their share. Conversation that Laura mentioned that is happening in the climate change corridors in the global north, that is not about people and how to sustain people's livelihoods. Yeah, it's about how to continue making profit on whatever is going on. The drought to the flooding. I think Somalia needs strong institutions. Somali territories all need better institutions that can predict, plan, and support, so that when the rain falls, it doesn't just flood the place, take the arable soil with it, and just shove it in the Indian Ocean, right? There needs to be some planning happening. What does recovery plan look like? Recovery plan needs to have a bit of a long-term predicting systems, and we need to get out of the mode of emergency response. The recovery that we're seeing in the Horn of Africa is all about saving people, saving lives, saving livestock. So we need recovery plans that are a little bit longer term, and with the limited resources they have, they might not be able to sit down and do that, but maybe with the help of international resources they can. Technology, the role of technology definitely needed now that there is enough technology to predict, to create systems that can then say that the rain is going to fail or it's going to be like this. So let's plan for it before we get into emergency mode. Let's do something about it and make sure that people get the right help at the right time. Synergizing the different efforts that are going on at a community level, at an institutional level, need to come together and hopefully have a more long-term outcome solutions in terms of the question you asked. Because there is a lot of effort, but it's a lot of effort at a grassroots level and not systems level. So we need to kind of build on the synergies. I think Laura responded to what is causing the cyclical droughts. Indigenous knowledge, as long as indigenous knowledge is not even valued, we won't be able to harness it. So it is on the responsibility of those of us who have gone to Western education schools, but also are part of the indigenous community, to bridge that. We need to bridge that and make the evidence and the local knowledge more prominent in the research world. I guess that would be my take on it. Policy in Somalia and taxation. Somalia needs institutions. They're not there. And what is there is really a predatory institutions that actually exploit. And, for the record, what is happening, especially in South Central Somalia, is war profiteering. It's not institution building. People are making money on the fact that people are stateless. So taxation, the person you give the taxes to take is it. So it doesn't really go to the government in a way that it can do something with it. So Somalia is quite not, especially South Central Somalia, quite not post-conflict. And there are no viable institutions. You need viable institutions before you can talk about taxation. Thank you.
I believe I strongly agree with what Laura said earlier and what Dr. Fausia was saying now, because I was just nodding my head like this, like, yes, yes, because they were just like putting the hammers on the points. I'd like to add a very quick point on the role of technology, which is, I think if like Somalis now, from where I am from and the rest of the Somalis learn the like sophisticated ways that we can harvest rainwater even, then we can store it more like water, like because we are losing water most of the time. And the second thing is the solar systems for alternative like energy. That's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, most of the questions has been already responded to. But I think let's look something completely different. From my perspective, we internationalize our problems and internationalize our solutions. We forgot that we are human beings who can also do their own thing. And we can actually, human beings, that people who really can solve their own problems. Somehow, we lost that we are responsible of what we are doing. The human-centered development itself, the technology, the attitude, perception is what we are doing. You see, whether it is a pastoralist group, whether it's agriculture, or whether development on urban areas, our governments are being governed by other policies that comes from somewhere else that doesn't necessarily compatible to the problems you have it on the ground. So I think what we are doing, and all this, even we used to have droughts all our lives, but we did have a coping mechanism systems where we can actually cope with them ourselves. We somehow, all of a sudden, forget that we can actually do it ourselves too, and then we have to wait, the government, international community, blah, blah. But in reality, by the time anybody reaches you, it's already too late. What we are not doing, and I think our population are not actually bringing back to our population, is to organize, plan, and start having their own coping, not only coping mechanisms, but other preventive measures on ground. Let's talk about floods. We have floods everywhere. We have enough rain. Just to look Somaliland, we have enough rains if you really look at it. But what do? The rain is changed. The patterns have been changed. It's now erratic, sporadic, not necessarily on time, things like that came. But the amount of water that you can get also is very high. You still have torrential areas, you have got water coming in. What we are not doing is creating watershed development systems to ensure that you don't have to lose all your water out. So we need to look at what we can do ourselves. Watershed management can be easily done, and then you don't have that much floods at all. People are just watching all their water coming and they passing in the road. Nobody's doing anything at all. And then everybody will say, we have no agencies doing it. What about you? So I think this is where we're really getting wrong. And indigenous knowledge, we are losing it. I was having one training in one of the village area, and we were talking about trees, biodiversity, things like that, and the younger generation doesn't even know the names anymore of these trees. And by not doing that, you are forgetting completely the value of that tree, the medicinal part of it, the traditional part of it, the greenery part of it, whatever contributions that is doing it. So because they don't know it, they just cut it for charcoal, or even selling, as you're saying, or that type of things. It really, we somehow, my feeling is, if we want to solve some of these problems, we have to go back to where we came from and try to do, international communities can help, but usually they are hindrance than doing it. Because I have a problem now. We have a lot of money being given to our population on the ground, even when there's no droughts. What is the impact of that one? Instead of going to my village and doing my own livestock and making sure that I cope with my own livelihood, I know somebody's going to give me 200 shillings or $200, so I don't have to really worry about it. And I think that is the first time I find that we are undermining the international community, or the other type of resources are undermining the traditional, not only that, but the production systems that we have in place. And we need to look at it. We are shouting with the government, nobody listening to it. But I think in the long term, everybody is saying, no. Technology is working. Everywhere you go in the countryside, people have got mobiles everywhere. It's just rampant everywhere you go. They have got all types of, if now you have rain there, instead of walking, they just take a truck. They will reach there. Solar systems are everywhere. So you have the technology there. We need the right policies in place. And whether it is international or national or even local, what we need, if we really want to have a development systems coming in, what we are doing are now, for the last 60 years, and you agree with me, of these international development funds, they undermined our systems. They are not doing anything at all. Sorry to say, nothing. You look at it, it's a waste of time, waste of resources, waste of energy. What we need is to look at weed in. thanks to the international, they can help you. But if you don't have the right policies in place, you don't have the right system going, if you don't looking what you are doing, let's look, we had this, again, workshop, and we asked people, what do you think the environment, we're talking about environment, so we say, okay, how does this place where we were at the time, look at 40 years before, now, and how do you predict this place will look at 40 years from now? Everybody was aware, especially the older people. Oh, we know that they have got that much this and that. So they actually described the whole system. And then they say, okay, what about the future? Now do we see that there's a time the terrace has been cut down, people are just doing it. We say, okay. They said 40 years from now, if we continue the trend we are doing now, this is going to be a desert. But if we change the direction and stop what we are doing, the harmful practices that was going on, and try to invest on the land, we can train it back to where it came from. So people know, but we are not giving that responsibility back to them. We're just trying to take our shoulders, NGOs, international communities, small amount of money, the short-termism of the whole thing. It's not working, to be honest with you. So sorry, but I think we need to go back to it.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our amazing speakers. I totally agree, every single one of them, on what they have said. I think we need a systematic change, whether it's from the local, international, or policy level. But I have a hope, because we have these amazing young women who are doing a lot of things for the Horn of Africa, and we have Laura, who is actually doing from a systematic but also from a political lens. So I think we have hope, and of course all of you guys are like there and want to learn more about the region, and also, you know, we can change something when we come together. And of course, I totally agree with what Saadia said. I think always we blame the international community, and of course they have a huge role, but also sometimes you need to take the role and do something, whether when it comes to the individual, but also from your local owned community, because those are the things that will change at the end of the day. And if we want to change Somalia or Somaliland or the Horn of Africa as a whole, I think we need to take an initiative. We shouldn't wait NGO or international community, but we have to teach our local community and our government or our policies that's there for us. We need to implement it and also come up with laws that could force some of these policies that, you know, so we have a lot of policies, but we don't implement it, and that's the issue. And the international community will not come and implement for these policies. So I agree with you, and thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you all for coming tonight. And if you want to chat with our speakers or take a picture, please, they are here. And again, thank you so much, and hopefully I will see you again.